Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, Women Who Code, for giving me this opportunity to speak, and thanks in advance to all the listeners who are tuned in. And I really hope that like we can all get something productive out of this session. At the very least, I was thinking that this is a topic that we don't really talk about too much, and at the very least, this could spin off a discussion. But I tuned in a few minutes earlier, and I was so inspired and impressed by the panel that was talking about unexpectedly out of work. So hopefully this can just build on top of the previous discussion. About me, Sarah already gave an introduction, but I'm Krithika Chandramouli. I was born and raised in India, and I moved to the US for grad school. And ever since, I've been living in California. I'm a software engineer, and I'm at Meta. And prior to Meta, I was at a fintech company called FactSet. And prior to that, I started my career at a company called Fandango Now. It was previously called MGO. And I'm a very outdoorsy person. I like to hike, I like to run. And then in my free time, I also do some writing. Again, Sarah mentioned that. Please check out my Medium if you have some time. Today's agenda, I wanted to, right off the bat, talk about what today's agenda was not about. Today's agenda is not about, going over statistics of how many layoffs have happened in the recent past, and or to even talk about what it means to be laid off. I think we had a great panel discussion on that. Or what the current situation is like in the tech industry in Silicon Valley. But today's agenda is definitely to discuss some of the emotional aspects of navigating a layoff, and hopefully give people food for thought on how to think about a layoff, whether you have been impacted by one or you have survived one. I'm going to start off by talking about my own story about how I experienced a layoff. I was laid off once and I survived a layoff. And then I'll talk a little bit about resilience and my new favorite word, which is coming up. And then hopefully give some food for thought to listeners who may have been impacted by a layoff or listeners who have survived a layoff, and then close it with any question and answers. Okay, let's start with my layoff story, or rather, my story. Back in 2014, I just graduated from UCLA after, starting school for a master's in bioengineering, but switching majors to computer science. I was very pleased at that point because that was, I discovered my true passion, and to be able to earn a degree in what I was really passionate about was very thrilling to me. And I joined a startup called MGO, based in Los Angeles. They were building uh, a streaming service very similar to Google Play at the time. 1 year down the line, I still identified as a new grad. I was learning so much. I'm going to say at this point that my time at MGO played a big role in helping me build a foundation as a software engineer. I was still a new grad and I was on a student visa. And then one day, all of a sudden, it happened out of nowhere. I didn't know it could happen. I got laid off from MGO. Fast forward to 2018, interviewed in a bunch of places, had a short stint at FactSet. I got a job at then Facebook as a software engineer. And great, my learning experience started, Facebook learning experience started in 2018. Then so many things happened. COVID happened, Facebook got renamed to Meta, and like a lot of ups and downs. 2022 was an interesting year with return to work, but it was also interesting because there were words floating around like recession and economic downturn. And amidst all of this, one day, again, out of nowhere, there was a Wall Street Journal article that said Facebook was going to lay people off. And we had no idea whether to believe it or not. We did because there was no other communication and we had no choice but to anticipate that something like that was going to happen. And sure enough, within a week, there was a massive layoff, 13% of the company, 11,000 people, which also included some of my colleagues, friends, people I worked closely with. I survived. Okay, I'm going to preface the rest of this presentation by saying I love emojis. I wish I could speak in emojis, just in case you're curious about what's coming next. Back in 2015, I would say that it was so abrupt. It came out of nowhere. It was just another day. It was a Friday. I walked into the office and I had an email saying, okay, collect in the conference room. And I had no idea what it was going to be about. So you can imagine when I heard the words, you are no longer a part of this company, it felt like it came out of nowhere. It was confusing and I had so many unanswered questions. But that was not the end of it. The dark side is that I had all these um, complex emotions of self-doubt and insecurity and shame, which was the worst part of it. And overall, there was no closure that with what happened. I was just escorted out of the building, and I went from planning my day and thinking about all the tasks that I'm going to do to having no job in an hour. And fortunately or unfortunately, it was so early on in my career. I think there are both pros and cons. And now, fast forward to 2022, I was in a really stable place as far as my self confidence was concerned. Like, I knew I could rely on my skills. I'd worked on some interesting and impactful projects, and I knew that I could, brave the storm if there was one. But that didn't take away from the fact that there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen. The article came out on a certain day, and they said that in the next few days you'd find out. So it was days full of uncertainty and not knowing what was going to happen. There was a lot of fear for me personally because I'm on a work visa, which is again like an added layer of complexity being an immigrant. But definitely having that fear that you were just going to be forgotten, and all the work that you've done is going to be forgotten abruptly, just led to a lot of anxiety. And I must say that the announcement was made at 6 a.m. EST, which was 3 a.m. PST. My teammates and I, we stayed up the entire night just talking about what was going to happen, and refreshing our emails, refreshing our feeds just to see if there was any more news. So you can imagine how anxiety inducing that experience might have been. And having gone through this like range of emotions and having been at both ends of the spectrum, I started to reflect on how some of these difficult events in our lives can actually be used to our advantage and maybe help us become stronger and actually keep going through these difficult events. And that's how I was researching what it meant to be like that, or to derive strength out of something bad that happened to you. And that's how I stumbled upon this word, resilience. And, my research, and quite literally, the meaning of the word was your ability to recover from a setback or adapt to change and just like keep going in the face of adversity. And I can safely say that, having gone through a layoff, I can safely say that it is quite a traumatizing experience. But coming to my new favorite word, which I also stumbled upon when I was researching, it's called being anti fragile, and it was coined by author Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And what it really means is to go beyond being resilient, but actually getting better coming out of adversity. Um, and yeah, I wish I'd known anti-fragile existed. Then the stock would have been termed anti-fragile in the face of a layoff. But anyway, moving forward, I wanted to share some food for thought. This isn't really a list of do's and don'ts, but it's really a food for thought. A lot of it I derive based on my own personal experience. If you were impacted by a layoff, there's certain things that I've learned along the way. One is wondering if it was performance based. Don't do it. I think, yeah, this is a big don't. I think this is important. It's important to talk about this because after if you've been laid off, when I was laid off, I was in this place of extreme vulnerability and self doubt and a lot of uncertainty. And, wondering if it was performance based will only take you to a place of if onlys that you'll never be able to get out of unless you make an effort. As in life, there are many parameters that you really cannot control. um, and you may think that you have control over it. You may think that if it was based on your performance, the outcomes could have been different. But the truth is that more often than not, layoffs are executed by third party organizations that sometimes companies hire. So there isn't really too much control you have over what parameters they use to determine which which part of the company or who gets laid off. and and I've had conversations with several ICs in my company and several managers in my company, and no one's been able to reverse engineer what the parameters are for who gets laid off. So I think the foremost is to really let go of that thought that it was based on your performance and stop wondering about that, if that was a possibility. This one is a personal favorite. Decoupling your identity from your organization. And why I like this is because, in general, I think the idea of being a little detached it's nice to be. But I think that you may get a lot of motivation from aligning yourself with your organization's mission. And you may also feel like you're able to bring your best efforts forward and your best self forward, to be able to further your company's mission. Um, but the truth is that it's important to detach yourself from your organization that you're either a part of or you were until recently a part of. Because if in case of a layoff, the association was not voluntarily terminated, it was terminated for you on your behalf. And it can, to avoid feeling resentful in such a situation, it is and to easily move on, I think it's good to be able to say that you are you are your role first, and then you are your role at the company. For example, I would say that I'm a software engineer first, and in general I like JavaScript, and I like, solving people problems. And then I'd go one step further and say I'm a software engineer at Meta currently. Reflecting on your own growth, and I think it's important to be said, because sometimes, or at least in my case, and based on conversations with people I know, I think when you've just been laid off, it's easy to feel like your efforts have gone to waste, and all the time that you spent building something that you thought was meaningful will no longer you will no longer be remembered for that. But I think the truth is that your growth has been happening. It had been happening until the point where maybe you've experienced getting laid off, and it will continue to happen. And it is important to be kind to yourself and to really face the future, or be future facing, um, and think about your growth in terms of something that is more continuous than fragmented. And I think looking back should be only done to reflect on how far you have come. And I think this mindset of being future facing, and really respecting your growth over time, um, is eventually what will help you land your next big opportunity. This may seem like a textbook phrase, but I feel like this has to be said. That it's good to treat your layoff like a fresh start. I think someone in the previous panel talked about how they had taken that time off and actually taken time to gain new skills, and like move to a new apartment, and actually tried and refreshed their life. And I'd say that's the way to go. Treating it as a fresh start definitely helps you shrug off feelings of resentment that you may have, sometimes undeservingly, towards your previous coworkers. And I think that it's important to uh, look at this event as something that was the close of a chapter, and again, building on my previous point, to be future facing, and treat this as a fresh start. And this one I had to say, because if you are anything like I was when I got laid off, I was so consumed in my own shame and self doubt that I didn't feel like I could reach out. I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone. I didn't feel like anyone would understand what I had just been through. Of course, I have to say that layoffs seem a lot more um, common these days. I feel like every day I read in the news that people are getting laid off, or companies are laying off um, uh, employees. So I feel like there is a big opportunity to find a circle of support for anything that you need. If you're trying to find a new opportunity, if you're trying to use this time to really pursue other things that you haven't done so far, or like in my case, if you're an immigrant and you need support on that front, I think finding a circle of support can definitely help you um, face whatever is next, and really help you get perspective on where you want to go from here on. And then professional networking. I know I said I wouldn't go into some of these more obvious ones, but I can't help but like bring up an example from my own story. From when I was at MGO, I had actually interviewed a few months back, before my then layoff, at a fintech company. Um, through a common friend, and I had gotten an offer but decided at the time that I didn't want to switch because I was learning a lot at my then current company, MGO. But when I got laid off, I thought I should probably reach out to them and see if they might be interested in interviewing me again. Turns out they were interested and they didn't even want to re interview me. So I had an offer in a few weeks' time. And I'd say that the fact that I had done some networking, some interviewing earlier on had definitely helped me. So definitely feel free, you should feel free to reach out to people you've networked with earlier, even when you were not looking for new opportunities. First degree, second degree, third degree connections. You'll never know when you might stumble upon your next big opportunity. All right. If you've survived a layoff, I think there is much to be said about this as well. And I think there is a lot of food for thought, um, for if you have survived a layoff, because it has its own challenges. And I think one of the biggest challenge is overcoming survivor guilt. I think I've read that term far too many times in the last few months, just trying to process my own emotions and trying to figure out why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Um, but I did feel like losing a lot of my colleagues induced feelings of grief in addition to guilt. And I did come across the word mourn in the same context, and I felt like it did make sense because one day you are sitting next to these people, you're eating lunch with them, you're talking about all this cool stuff that you're working on and all this progress that has to be made on your projects, and the next thing you know, the desk is empty, you don't have answers, again you don't know why they got laid off. um, it leads to a lot of guilt. And I think at that point, you'd even be willing to bargain your own position in the company just to help out a friend. And this is based on evidence because I've seen a lot of people who came up after after the big round of layoffs saying, um, is it possible for you to terminate my job but give my friend's job back? And unfortunately, although I think it's a great idea, voluntarily getting laid off, it doesn't seem to work that way, and I think it can't possibly change anything. um, so it's important to overcome that guilt. And I want to uh, I want to say that it's very easy to get caught up in that. It took me almost, yeah, like it took me a lot of time just to come to terms with the fact that my coworker who used to sit right next to me, and we would go into the office every day, and get lunch together, was no longer at the company. And it's really easy to get caught up in that guilt, so it's important to overcome that guilt. Invest in transferable skills, and I think this is more relevant now than ever because we are seeing this big shift in the industry. There's so many companies that are laying off people. We read the news every day. There's, yeah, my LinkedIn feed is filled with uh, either news about companies laying off or about someone who just got laid off. And I think it's while you are working on your job specific skills, it is also important to keep in mind that with the future being unpredictable, it is important to have skills, at least some skills that you can take with you, and you could just like plug into another organization or another team and you'd still be productive. So I think it's really important to invest intransferable skills. It keeps you going, it keeps you flexible, and I think that flexibility is eventually like a really important skill to have. Rethinking your growth strategy, I think this kind of builds off of my previous point where I talked about how the industry is getting unpredictable. Now, personally, you might have, there's a lot of uh, everyone's career path is unique, and personally, you might have your own goals for what you want to achieve this year and how you want to grow in your career. Maybe you're a front end engineer, you want to become a full stack engineer. Maybe you want to become a PM, or maybe you are an IC and you want to transition to being a people person, like a manager. And I think there's a lot of combinations here. Everyone's path is unique. Some of these strategies might actually work in your favor in especially in the current scenario where there's a lot of transition happening in the industry, a lot of priorities are shifting. But some strategies might not work. For me, maybe at this point, transitioning to a manager from an IC may not be the best route. And so I should be able to come up with a plan B and plan C for how I want to steer my career through uncertain times. And knowing the market, again, feels like a no brainer, but I think it's important to know, especially with all of these impending changes in the industry, it's important to know who's hiring, who's not. Even if you aren't looking for a new opportunity, I think this is something that can really help your friends and peers who may have been impacted by a layoff. You can serve as that first, second, third degree connection that I talked about in the previous section. Professional networking and decoupling your identity from your organization. Again, coming back to these points, just like I mentioned in the previous section, it is so important to really build that sense of detachment, even if you survived a layoff, especially in current times when things are changing so much and we don't know what's going to happen maybe one quarter from now or even one half from now. And I think it's really important to keep the networking and keep that detachment going forward. Closing thoughts. I definitely think that layoffs are traumatic and very abrupt, and there's really no sense of closure. Um, and this is how I kind of processed it when I survived a layoff. That a small section, actually, correction, it isn't a small section, it is a lot of people who are impacted and lose their jobs. But at the end of the day, everyone is affected. People who have been impacted, they don't know how their future is going to pan out and what kind of opportunities they will be met with. But people who are affected grieve the vacuum that is created from all this reorganization and restructuring in the places where they work. And I think at the end of the day, experiences like these should make us a little more anti fragile and resilient. Um, it is a solid life lesson that's learned along the way. And most of all, I think what's important to realize is that we have empathy for each other. I want to, yeah, like I have another story, and this is from the time when I was laid off in MGO. All the paperwork was done, and I was being escorted out of my of the office building, and my then mentor, who I really owe a lot of my career to him. And we walked out of the building, and then I turn around. I was still in shock, and I look at him, and he had tears in his eyes. And I don't think I will ever forget that in my life. You know, who was I was just a new grad, an entry level engineer, trying to understand what it means to work in the software industry. And here was this person who was, he was a pretty senior guy, and he had, um, you know, like, he had shown in that moment that he understood what it meant to go through something like that. And his tears, I will always remember them. And I think that's the kind of empathy that we should all strive to build, in uncertain times like these, in difficult times like these. Last but not least, I was, it's award season, everyone knows. I was watching old award acceptance speech, and this was Russell Crowe, one of my favorite actors, winning an Oscar for one of my favorite movies. And in his speech, he said, if anybody is on the downside of advantage and relying purely on courage, it's possible. Now, I know it doesn't apply directly, but it resonated so much with me, and I had to put that in here. Um, yeah, thank you so much. This was resilience in the face of layoffs.
Thank you so much, Krithika, for presenting the unfortunate topic that is on everyone's mind, which is layoffs in tech. But this was an amazing talk. And I have a lot of questions for you. And I know that we're going to have a few in the chat as well. So please feel free to share any questions that you have for Kritika in the chat. And we will start sharing them on the screen. But I do have one question for you. You mentioned knowing the market, and sometimes a layoff can bring um, new opportunities. So, what is exciting you right now in the tech industry?
I think there's a lot of buzz about AI.
Mhm.
Everyone's talking about building on top of, like Chat GPT
Yeah,
and other applications of AI. And I myself keep coming across so many different opportunities. And I think that's definitely something to watch out for and be excited about.
yeah,
And it's definitely going to create plenty of opportunities.
yeah, definitely. Um, okay, so it looks like we have one that says how to determine the transferable skills in one's profile. So how would you determine what the transferable skills are?
Yeah, I think it, like, generally speaking, it depends on your role. For example, if you are a front end engineer, I would say that, instead of really diving deep into a particular framework, try and think about how you might build a scalable system, for example, or like how you can make your UI faster or more efficient. And I think knowledge of that in this case might be transferable, and you could apply that to any framework that you end up working on. Or if you are, if you are a full stack engineer, then probably understanding how to, like how to architect your systems in a way that they are more robust and resistant to failures is something that's more transferable. um, as you grow more in your career, I think, if you're able to, like, working with people is definitely a transferable skill. And if you're able to gain that kind of an experience, you can take that anywhere and really plug into any organization. These are some examples
Yeah,
based on where you are in your career right now.
yeah. If you have just a little bit of people management skill, I definitely would recommend using that. Okay, so we have another question from Carly. What in the most ideal world would you have wanted as support from your community or even previous employer? That's a good question.
I think for me personally, immigration issues are definitely at the top of the list. As an immigrant, I think it is so. Um, it's important to remember that a lot of people, they just come to the US to find work, but eventually end up building their lives here. And so, in the event of being laid off abruptly, um, it kind of shakes up everything in their lives, and they have to do a lot of thinking around what it means next for them, and not just in terms of their career, in terms of where they're going to live, and what kind of a place it'll be, and whether they'll have to move. So I think, and I know that there are quite a few people who are like that, immigrants who are afraid of something like this happening to them. So
No,
I'd say that that's on top of my list.
I think this is a big question that I think a lot of people are wondering. Um, but yeah. Okay, so this is going to be our last question from Javiva. I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. But what are some of your favorite mindful practices? I myself am all about a great quiet time, art sessions, great snacks, and a daily nap. I also love a daily nap. I just realized that I'm like a preschooler. Same. So, Kritika, if you could tell us, what are some of your mindful practices that you do?
I think, for me, maybe my morning coffee and unloading the dishwasher.
Okay, same.
It
That
might
is
sound silly.
no, I definitely agree with that. That is like set. That is like top routine for me. Just having a clean sink is perfect.
Yeah,
That's
it
great.
really, like, somehow the act of organizing things around you can sometimes really lead to that sort of mental decluttering and combing through your tangled emotions.
That I couldn't have said better than myself. That's great. Okay, well, thank you everyone for sharing your amazing questions. I want to give a big thank you to Kritika for your time today and your amazing talk. I want to thank everyone so much for joining the session and being a great audience. Everyone seemed to be very empowered by your story. I was definitely empowered by it.